Okay, so we're going to stay close to time and start our panel. Welcome to Secrets of the Archives, Why We Preserve Documents in the Digital Age. I'm Janet Sinder. I'm the library director here at Brooklyn Law School. Today we have what I think you will find to be 5 fantastic speakers who are going to talk about a number of different aspects of the question of why we continue to preserve documents even in the digital age. I'm going to introduce all of them now in the order that they're speaking, and we do expect to have some time for questions at the end. So I will start at the far end with Mike Widener, who has been the rare book librarian at the Lillian Goldman Law Library at Yale Law School since 2006. Before his appointment at Yale, he served for 14 years as the head of special collections at the Tarleton Law Library at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also on the faculty of the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. He's taught a week-long intensive course there called Law Books, History, and Connoisseurship since 2010. He's published a number of articles on legal archives, historical legal bibliography, and book collecting. Mike has been a consultant to law libraries at the University of Wyoming, Texas Tech, St. Mary's University, and the, I'm going to try this, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. How was that? On their rare book collection. He's on the Board of Trustees of the Connecticut Supreme Court Historical Society and previously was a trustee of the Texas Supreme Court Historical Society. In 2012, he was elected to membership in the Grolier Club, the leading society for book collectors in the United States. He has a bachelor's degree in journalism and a master's degree in library and information science, both from the University of Texas. Our next speaker is Julia Walworth, who is the fellow librarian at Merton College, Oxford. She studied at Swarthmore College, Yale University, and Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich, receiving her PhD in History of Art from Yale in 1991. Before moving to Merton in 2001, she was head of special collections and then head of historic collections at the Senate House Library at the University of London. Her research interests include the history of manuscripts and early printed books in Western Europe. She's the author of a book on the function of illustration in 13th century German literary manuscripts and articles and reviews in the areas of medieval visual culture, library history, and the use of special collections in academic libraries. Our third speaker is Fenella France, who's the acting director and chief of the Preservation, Research and Testing Division at the Library of Congress, specializing in researching and implementing non-destructive imaging and analysis techniques and the prevention of environmental degradation to collections. Her current focus is the development of spectral imaging techniques and increasing links and access between scientific and scholarly data, enabling better interpretation and visualization of linked data for the humanities. She received her PhD from Otago University in New Zealand and her MBA from Deakin University in Australia. After lecturing at Otago, she was the research scientist for the Star-Spangled Banner Project at the Smithsonian Institution. An international specialist on polymer aging and environmental damage to cultural objects, she focuses on links between mechanical properties and chemical changes from environmental damage and treatment protocols, and the capacity to measure these changes through non-invasive methods. She has worked on a diverse range of projects, including the World Trade Center artifacts, pre-Columbian mummies and textiles, the Ellis Island Immigration Museum, and imaging of Founding Father documents. So she has a lot of New York connections there. Chris Beauchamp teaches and writes in the areas of intellectual property and legal history. His first book, which Nick mentioned, Invented by Law, Alexander Graham Bell and the Patent That Changed America, was published by Harvard University Press in 2014. He's also working on a book about the history of patent law and litigation in the United States entitled Technologies Trials. He joined Brooklyn Law School from the University of Pennsylvania, where he was a Sharswood Fellow in Law and History and a lecturer in law. He was also a Microsoft LAPA Fellow at Princeton University's Law and Public Affairs program and a Samuel I. Golub Fellow in Legal History at NYU's School of Law. He has a PhD in history from Cambridge University. And our final speaker, Christina Mulligan, teaches courses in internet law and intellectual property. Her scholarship addresses intellectual property, and the relationship between law and technology, and her research seeks to better adapt intellectual property for the digital age. She joined the faculty from the University of Georgia Law School, where she taught from 2013 to 2014. She also served as a postdoctoral associate and lecturer in law for the Information Society Project at Yale. She earned her bachelor's degree cum laude and her law degree cum laude from Harvard University, and she was a production and article editor at the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology. She also served as a staff attorney at the Institute of Justice and a law clerk for Judge Charles Letow of the Court of Federal Claims. So, without further ado, I will turn the program over to our first speaker, Mike Widener.
Thank you all. It's an honor to be here today. As Janet explained in the introduction, I do have a bias here. I make my living by collecting law books and manuscripts, but it's a great way to make a living. And my colleagues and I, we often confront the issue of, is it still useful to do this? You know, I mean, there's big institutions, the Law Library of Congress, collected all these great things that you see displayed in the exhibit downstairs. Other people, and I want to specifically focus, not just in general, but why should law school libraries collect things like this? And the issues we get oftentimes are things like, well, everything is online, or at least everything that's important is online. Online is better. Online is cheaper, and those are true in some cases, but in many instances, they're not. I think these original artifacts are incredibly important for both research and teaching, and I think there's a lot of opportunities here for law school libraries to be collecting, big and small libraries. One of the things is, I just think the artifact is incredibly important. This is a quote from Thomas Tansel, one of the great bibliographers of the 20th century. The design of any book is worthy of study as a reflection of the taste of its time, as an indication of the stature of the author and genre represented, and as a clue to the nature of the audience expected for it. The medium is a big part of the message. I don't know if people on Facebook, there's a very interesting series, Humans of New York. And last night I saw something. There are these little vignettes, people of New York City, and a little vignette from their life. It starts out, this is the last one, I'm a rare book librarian. It caught my attention. And one of the things he said, a physical book assigns a sense of reverence to the content inside. And that's true, and I'd even broaden it and say that the physical books assigns a sense to the content. It's the physical object has a lot to do with the meaning of what's inside. Here's a 14th century Magna Carta manuscript that's in our collection at Yale. And this is kind of how you would normally see it displayed online. You see one page, although you would see also a lot of navigation buttons around the edge. But when you actually get a sense, this is a very, very small manuscript. I mean, you can see my hands there. There's actually another one just like it on display downstairs. And you can't really understand what's going on with this manuscript, a lot of it, unless you know the size. When I bring this thing out, it has an incredible impact on people when they see it, this tiny thing. It's also, it shows a two-page spread. You know, the online displays a lot of time really kind of do violence to the object by showing just one page. There's a PhD student at Yale that actually recently did a study of our manuscript, another one just like it that's next door at Beinecke, and a couple of others. And there's actually a lot of interesting things about these early Magna Carta manuscripts, the little bitty ones. The contents of these are remarkably consistent from one to the other, as opposed to the large Magna Carta manuscripts that can be a mishmash of all sorts of things. So there's a lot that can be learned from looking at the physical object. Here's, on the left is our little Magna Carta and the early printed editions. Again, the small size persisted as the transition into print. What's going on here? Why is that? Size matters. It has something to do with the purpose of the text, the way it's looked at, and so forth. And online really blinds you to things about size. It does a poor job of doing that. Here's another little keepsake of Magna Carta. The frontispiece to this is the Magna Carta commemorative stamp that you see downstairs. Here's a really beautiful fine press edition done in 1938. All these physical objects are very eloquent about how people look at Magna Carta in the times they were published as a text, as an iconic text. Author collections. Here's an example. William Shepherd is considered the most prolific legal author of the 17th century in England. Published a lot of books. Until you put them all together, you can see he published a lot of little bitty books, and you don't really see that until you get them all together and look at the physical objects. You can do the same thing with geographic collections, genre collections, topical collections. And you won't know what you will learn until you put them all together. The physical object is important for this. And this is also where you can see some opportunities for libraries to collect. You can put together something that will really set your library apart from other libraries. Every law library in the country has got Westlaw and Lexis. That's big deal. Things like this can really set your library apart. Also, ease of use. If you want to do comparative things, you can spread out 5 or 6 of these books on the table and really start to understand something about it. Try and get 5 or 6 windows open on your computer. You can't get your head around it. You'll go nuts. It's really much more efficient to do research this way for certain types of topics. Here's some more examples of Shepherd's books. Very simple books, very plain bindings. These really are eloquent. Look, here's another example here. This is, they didn't even trim the leather or put a paste down. I mean, this is a book, this shows this book was a workhorse, not a show horse. Again, you see the ownership marks. You see how the reader is interacting with the text, not just the text itself. The typography. The fact that on the title page here, you've got all these Bible verses. This is really eloquent to William Shepherd as a partisan of Cromwell and the Commonwealth and Puritans. Another example here, the signs of ownership. Who owned the book and what did they use it for? Indexes. Normally, when people search online text, you take some search terms and drill into the text that way. If you're using the print book, you actually have to use the indexes that were created at the time. And what it makes you do is get into the mindset using the conceptual framework of the people that created the book at the time. I think indexes like this are actually really important objects of research. It helps you get into the mind of the people at that time. Dust jackets, another really important thing. I mean, this tells you a lot about the book. This tells you this book was written for more or less a young readership. Also, it's fairly new. Post-1923 books, normally you can't find a lot of it online. Foreign law, another thing that's really largely absent online. Actually, there is a good bit in European libraries. They've digitized a lot of things, but to use them online, it's really quite tedious. You've got a page and page and page, and just wait for the things to scroll. It really makes you appreciate the value of a physical book as a random access technology. It's really quite efficient. Here's People may have run across this in Google Books, things that are missing. And actually, I've done a disservice to Google Books because I've removed all the other things around there. You know, buy the ebook version, you know, the other thing about doing a lot of reading online, you've got all the buttons and navigations, all these things around the margins, you know, click me, and do this. It's tiring, and there's been studies, your retention of material you read online is actually a good bit lower. And the cost, you know, you think of these, they're great collections, you know, The Making of Modern Law and so forth, but basically you're paying a lot of money to rent content year after year. They're expensive, they're not cheap. And you can build a really focused collection around a certain topic for a good bit less than what you invest in these yearly subscriptions. Again, not everything is online. This is a book that I actually kept out of a Making a Modern Law digitization project. Partly they would have hated it because it's got an interleave page there. It's got all these marks, the things that make this book really a fascinating book for study. Here's a great example of how lawyers actually doing their work. This is part of a lawyer's toolbox. You can see lawyers working here. Here's another example from the same book. This is actually the excerpts from Magna Carta and the South Carolina statutes. And you can see the interest that this guy's placing in those parts of Magna Carta there. Another thing that's not available online, this particular item, legal briefs in general, not well represented. We acquired this because we collect in Native American law. What we ended up with is actually also, it's a brief authored by Belva Lockwood, the very first woman to to be admitted to practice before the U.S. Supreme Court. So you'll get a lot of things. And in general, these collections of briefs are becoming much more available now. There's a lot of law firms that are jettisoning these things. And I guarantee you'll find some jewels in all of them. A great opportunity. Also, book dealers, most book dealers have no idea about this stuff. They just can't get their heads around it. They don't understand it. So for law people buying this stuff, there's a great opportunity. We can see the value where other people won't. Something else that's not online. I bought for the illustrations, but what an evocative document of the 1970s. Also for the history of legal aid. And you can't find this online. We have the only copy in OCLC. Another one, here's something published here in Brooklyn in the 1960s that I bought for our American Trials collection. And again, it's building special collections is not just about buying old stuff. This is a great thing. It's about a guy who was accused of criminal anarchy because he was protesting the death of a black teenager in New York City at the hands of a New York City cop. A really evocative piece of the times. And yet another one. Here's something born right here in this neighborhood. The Monsters Meet on Court Street. We have almost a complete run. This is something you can actually buy still from the publisher for a really reasonable price. For law and popular culture collections, what a great piece. So there's lots of opportunities. Finally, though, I just think these things are incredibly valuable. These collections are incredibly valuable for teaching. I work with a lot of classes, not just legal history classes. I've had classes in maritime law, Native American law, classes from outside of the law school, classes on the Italian Renaissance and so forth. So it's a great way of building connections with other departments. And the thing about these things that makes them so important, these artifacts, it engages all of the senses. It's not just the sight, but smell and touch. And, invariably, I do these sessions, and one of the first questions I get, can I touch it? Can I turn the pages? I mean, people just get this. And these things are memorable, much more memorable than a PowerPoint presentation or something. I mean, it makes a visceral connection with students. And it, especially for in law schools, it's a way to connect to law students with the physical artifacts of their professional ancestors. I've said a number of times, if there's nothing I do, more than I do, than show law students that they're entering a profession with a long and distinguished history, then I've done something of value. And it's also, finally, it's part of how special collections are really changing their roles. They used to be very much treasure rooms. You know, you have to have special permission and so forth, and, you know, only scholars or maybe grad students, but no undergraduates. And people are really getting away from that now. And they're becoming really, special collections are taking seriously their job, their role in the teaching missions of their institutions. When I started out, I remember saying oftentimes, you know, I'm not running a museum. This is all part of the library. And I've kind of moved on to say, well, I actually am running a museum of sorts. I'm running, it's in the model I use as a children's museum, this hands-on thing that where people can really make connections with the materials. It's a much more fun way of doing it also. And these collections are not for everyone, but I think there's really some enormous opportunities that law school libraries can take advantage of, and I hope they do. So thank you.
Julia?
I'm sorry. This is forward.
Okay.
That's back.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. This morning, I'm going to be looking at some aspects of the value of original documents and how they are used. And since we are marking the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, I will illustrate these general observations from specific examples from medieval documents and from Magna Carta itself. But the points that I will be making, I think will apply to originals of many periods and many formats. And just to summarize these points at the very start, my observations are that the line between special collections and working records can sometimes be a fuzzy one. Original documents may have many functions over time, and they may have many functions concurrently. Secondly, that a comparison, I'll just take it on a little diversion to a comparison between the Magna Carta and Merton College's own foundation charter that can bring out some interesting aspects of both of them, each of these documents. And thirdly, the study of originals and the use of electronic versions and new technologies are complementary very frequently and often inextricably linked, not necessarily alternatives. So we'll start with looking at the value and function of original documents and a personal story about one particular historical document and its surprising legal status. Now, going back to the 13th century, where we've already been this morning, when the 20 scholars of the very newly established Merton College began settling into their Oxford site, and this was in the late 1260s, they were able to make use of existing buildings as temporary quarters. So one of the earliest buildings that they built expressly for themselves was a treasury building. This was a tower room designed to minimize the risks of fire, flood, and theft. It basically comprises one large vaulted room on the second floor of a stone building. It's reached via a narrow flight of stairs. The stairway itself is protected by thick doors, both at the bottom and the top. Each door has 3 separate locks, which require individual keys. So in total, 6 keys to get access to this room, each of these keys to be held by a different individual. So what did they store in this room that was protected so thoroughly? It seems to me perhaps more thoroughly than perhaps a nuclear warhead or something, if we believe movies like Mission Impossible, that you seem to need only 2 keys to set off nuclear disaster. So in this treasury room, there were cash reserves, but not a huge amount. The college was young at this period. There were also some valuable physical objects, perhaps like a silver chalice, the sort of objects that you would need for the chapel, or silver for the dining table. But more important than any of these were the title deeds to college estates and the college's own financial and administrative records. On these pieces of parchment, the college's entire existence and income depended. This was the real treasure. These closely guarded deeds and records were well kept. They consisted of large and small parchment documents, some of them bigger than Magna Carta, some of them about the size of a 3x5 card. They accumulated over the centuries. The college continued to produce records. Every institution does. These records changed formats. They moved from parchment to paper, eventually to electronic media. They overflowed into other storage spaces. Though I'm happy to say that the Treasury building was well built, and we are still using the 13th century Treasury building to store some of our administrative records today. The medieval documents that were preserved there now form a wonderful historical resource. Some of them can be considered works of art, as an example of this is a license in Mortmain from the 1380s with a wonderful illuminated initial just at the beginning, showing a very young and slender King Richard II and handing the charter to the warden and fellows of Merton College there. These were once working records. They've now become sort of precious artifacts. They're valuable for researchers. If they're decorated, as this one is, they're often requested for exhibitions. But the majority of them have become divorced from their original purpose. At least this was really what I believed as responsible for the archives and the special collections of the college. But until one day in February 2006, when the estate's bursar contacted the archivist and myself, because the college was issuing a lease on a commercial property in central Oxford, in the middle of the city, and they needed the title deeds. Everyone had been looking for the title deeds for this particular piece of property. And it turned out eventually, after some sort of searching, that the college had owned this land for so long that the ownership had never been registered. The original license of Richard II, this document that you see here, which is about this big, it's an imposing document. This document was the proof of ownership. It still retained its full legal commercial value, and in a rather unusual procedure, at least we've never had to do this before, we had to get out this document from the archives and produce it for the lawyers of the lessees in order to carry out the conveyancing transaction. We also had to write out for them a transcription of the Latin, it's all in Latin, and a translation of it, authenticate a photographic reproduction. So sometimes, quite surprisingly, the world of special collections and the world of archives meets the world of current records and current commercial transactions, even after more than 6 centuries. If the original had been lost, would some kind of copy perhaps have done as well? I'm not a lawyer, I don't know, I'll leave that to the lawyers, but it certainly would not have made the same impact. and would not have seen the wonderful expression on the faces of the legal team when they were confronted with this huge document with the original Great Seal of Richard II right there. So an even older document than this Mortmain license, an older document, one of our most important documents in the college archives is its foundation charter. It was issued in 1264, which was almost 50 years after the first issue of Magna Carta. And it's almost as impressive in size as a document, although it relates to a much smaller context. It possesses, for a certain group of people anyway, the same sort of iconic value, and has acquired a significance beyond its original purpose over the succeeding centuries. In its content, the Merton Charter is more like a constitution than a Bill of Rights. It was issued by the founder of the college and sets out the principles on which the college is based. It establishes the endowment to support the college and the structure of its self-governance. It really established the college as a corporate entity. The seals of the king, Henry III, that's the largest one there. He was the son of King John, just to remind you, and the Bishop of Winchester provide evidence of the approval of church and state for this new institution. Now, it seems a little cheeky, really, to compare the charter of a single college with a document like Magna Carta. But if we consider them together, we find some telling similarities and differences. Unlike Magna Carta, the Merton Charter relates to one community, and there is only one original. And as you've heard this morning, the Magna Carta had a number of originals written out in 1215. But there are some affinities as well with Magna Carta, and in particular in those parts of the Merton Charter that discuss the limitations of the power of the warden, who is the head of the college, that perhaps the equivalent of Dean Allard. The warden, for instance, could be forced to step down if a group of senior fellows, and this is the formal fellows as scholars of the college, found that he was not doing his job properly. There was a mechanism set in place of mutual mutual scrutiny. It worked both ways. Mutual scrutiny. Merton also, the Merton Charter also resembles Magna Carta in that it rapidly gained a wider significance beyond its original scope. Because Merton was the first academic college in England, this charter became a blueprint for the establishment of other self-governing colleges, in other words, the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge. Now, one of the features of Magna Carta that strikes the modern readers is its concatenation of very detailed rights. And we've seen this in the talk this morning. The Merton Charter is in the same tradition. There's the same sort of mixture of some general principles and very, very specific things, particular provisions that have long been superseded or we are now considered anachronistic. We no longer need to worry, for instance, about fellows trying to feed and stable their horses free of charge at college farms, for instance. But the core principles have remained remarkably the same and continue to guide the college in its purpose today. And as we have seen this morning in the talk and through exhibitions like the Law Library of Congress ABA exhibition downstairs, Magna Carta itself has acquired a symbolic power that's much more far-reaching than the intent of the original document. So I'd like to stay with Magna Carta as an example for my next point, which is that the material and physical aspects of original documents sometimes are studied now more intensively than ever before but with the aid of digital versions and the assistance of new technology. And this is definitely the case even with very well-studied documents. You would almost think after 800 years there wouldn't be much more that we have to learn about Magna Carta, but in fact there's plenty to learn. And new technologies are often used in conjunction with the originals and in fact depend on the originals. Now, an excellent example is provided by new research that's been done just in the context of this anniversary year. One of the two original 1215 Magna Carta documents that are kept at the British Library was damaged in a fire in 1731. And that's the document you see on the left. It looks perhaps like it's just a very bad slide, but actually that is pretty much what the document looks like. The fire caused the parchment to shrink, and but even in its damaged condition, its text could be read after the fire. So ironically, it was conservation efforts in the 1830s trying to use what were then the latest techniques, but they were sort of physical, applying chemicals and things to the parchment, actually left the document in its current state, what you see on the left, pretty much invisible, with the text pretty much invisible to the naked eye. Now, much more recently, a non-invasive technology, and I think we're going to be hearing a little bit more about this later this morning very shortly, has helped historians to answer long-standing questions about Magna Carta, which is how the document was actually transmitted or communicated throughout England in 1215. And historians and paleographers who study, are experts in medieval handwriting, have been looking at all the originals of Magna Carta and using multispectral imaging, which produces, if you can see on the right, there's a detail of the British Library Magna Carta under ultraviolet light. And that helps them read the script. Well, it's useful. They knew the text. The importance for them is the actual physical script. And they've been comparing the handwriting of the 4 surviving original Magna Carta documents with other documents issued at the same time. And they've been coming to the conclusion that rather than using the normal royal channels of communication, in fact, Magna Carta was, as Derek Taylor said this morning, set out to the cathedral towns using the methods of communication through the English bishops. And this sounds like a very minor antiquarian point, but in fact, and I don't have time to go into it today, but it gets to a whole new way of understanding Magna Carta in the 13th century and the role of the church, its ecclesiastical and religious importance for the contemporaries in the 13th century. And here are some of the scholars in the British Library at Magna Carta Unification Day in February 2015 with the 4 originals there. Like Michael Widener, I'm going to conclude with a general observation about the importance of original documents, whether they be books, manuscripts, medieval documents, or more recent ones, not just for specialist researchers, but for the non-specialists. I totally endorse what Michael said. Working in an academic institution, I would say that there is nothing as inspiring. These are first-year history students, as the real thing, as real documents, real books, things you can get your hands on, and things you can study in the flesh, actually, literally, if it's a parchment document. And I think I'll end with that. Yeah.
you, Julia.
You're without a presentation.
No, Fenella.
Oh, I'm sorry. This is forward and that's back.
Good morning, everyone, and I want to thank Janet so much for it's delightful to be here with you all this morning. So you've heard a lot about the importance of the original, and now I'm going to talk about what we can actually find in the original that shows why keeping those is so important. The spectral imaging really can find information that's not visible from the original document, so it's contained within it, but if we digitize and throw away the original, you're not going to see what's there, whereas the spectral imaging captures both visible and non-visible information. And I also want to talk about what some of the others have mentioned, is that linking that new digital object back to the original makes a much richer source of information from these historic documents. As a scientist, I'm going to have 2 technical slides, and then it's all really fun images. So the system we use essentially was developed from satellite imaging, using a 39 megapixel camera developed from medical imaging, and using LEDs for illumination, because a very low light, very low heat makes the system incredibly non-invasive. The different modes of illumination that we use are reflected, transmitted, and also side lighting or raking lighting. That brings up a lot of different types of information. So what we essentially see as we go through is these narrow wave bands of light, and each one of these is captured in a monochrome and put together into a stack of images. As you'll see, as we go through this stack of images, different parts start to appear and disappear as we move through the different wave bands and the response of the different chemicals to what's on that original material. And a lot of what we do now is the processing of that stack of images. I really love the fact that we've got to the point now where I've encouraged a curator not to ask what I can do with a document, but essentially to say, tell me what their question is, and then we can process it to try and see what we can find. So we start with what we call a full spectrum colour image, because we have about 8 wave bands in the visible. It's much more than normal RGB camera. But you'll see on the left there, this is a 1320 nautical chart, very faint green lines. That's a copper-containing pigment called verdigris, which is corrosive. When we process this, we do pseudo-colours because it enhances the differences between different materials and features on the document. I can talk more about that at break if you are very interested in the technical component, but essentially this is exactly the same image that's been processed. You can now see a thick purple line. That's the copper eating into the parchment. So now we're understanding a lot more about what's really happening to these documents that you can't see just by looking at them. Let's jump into some really interesting examples from our founding fathers. So Jefferson's handwritten draft of the Declaration of Independence, original track changes. When he made a change, crossed out the line very neatly and wrote above that line what the change was. If it wasn't his change, in the margin he put Dr. Franklin or Mr. Adams and assigned the change to the exact person who made that change. So as I was looking at this document, I realised that there was one place on the 3rd page where there was a smudge rather than the normal cross-out, which seemed very odd. It was unusual, the only smudge we found. And in fact, the inks there were very similar, but as I started to work with this and process it, you can start to see the upper text, which is a darker blue, the lower text, which is a green. Looks like there's a T at the end, maybe a dot there somewhere. Well, to cut a very long story short, and lots of processing, he'd originally written fellow subjects and changed it to fellow citizens, which is a reasonably significant change. I was sure there must have been some reference to this somewhere, so finally found a researcher in Princeton who'd been going through Jefferson's papers. Jefferson noted he was copying from the Virginia Constitution that was written 2 months earlier, and he said, as I wrote this word, I realised it was wrong for our new country, so I expunged it, never to be seen again. So in the sub-basement at the Library of Congress, we are de-expunging documents. Let's take that a little bit further. You heard earlier about James Madison, and during the Constitution debates, there were note-takers taking notes of all of the discussions. However, James Madison apparently mumbled very badly and was very difficult to hear. So on his notes, he actually then added in afterwards pencil annotations, adding in his thoughts of things that he had thought were important in various areas. However, not sure why, but in latter years he went through with his nephew and had his nephew erase those annotations. You probably know where we're going here. We now are erasing those annotations. So we've just finished imaging with spectral imaging, 695 pages of the Madison Constitution debate papers, and there must be a wealth of information in there that I haven't even had a chance to look at yet. The L'Enfant Plan of Washington, D.C. You've heard about conservation treatments that are often the best idea at the time. So this was starting to fade. It was on display at the Land Grants Office. They decided in their wisdom to cover it with a varnish, a high glue coating, which in fact ended up obscuring it even more. This is what you currently see when you look at it. This is actually what's underneath. So you can see how the street grid, original street grid, just pops out. We can go in and look at the President's House, or the White House as it's now known, Congress House or Capitol. We've got all of Jefferson's annotations on this also. He crosses out Congress and says, Capitol, this will be the centre of our new city. So what you're seeing here is this thought process contained within the original that we really are just starting to extract out and understand more effectively. Another beautiful document here, the Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln. Beautiful, beautiful writing. You see the first page written here on Mansion stationery, and then the second page is on rough blotter paper. At the bottom of that first page, he crosses out the last 3 lines in ink and starts writing in pencil, "We here be dedicated to the great task that remains before us." When we image this, and we always image the backs of documents, even though you might not think there's anything on them, we found these fluorescent regions, and in fact, what we found on that second page was a thumb on the front and 3 fingers on the back of the fold of that page that they think he wrote just before he gave the address at Lincoln. So my mission now is to try and find a known fingerprint of Lincoln's to be able to prove whether or not this in fact is Lincoln's document, is Lincoln's fingerprints. I've been working with the US Criminal Investigation Lab. They're developing software to put together parts of fingerprints. And I've also imaged the Emancipation Proclamation and the first and second inaugural addresses that have a number of part fingerprints on them. So as you can see here, just a wealth of different types of information that you might never think was around or available. When we do the processing, we can also find some very interesting things. So you know on the original document, these 2 inks looked exactly the same. They were black. But in fact, when we process them, because they're chemically different, they respond differently because of their spectral response. So we've just assigned a false colour here. The writing ink is showing up blue, but you're also seeing dark and light blue sections. This is actually the intensity of his writing. So we now can go back through historic documents where people were taught to describe the same and start to separate out potentially different authors of historic documents. Really interesting. You may also be a little bit sceptical. It's like, well, what happens if they were in a different mood that day? We have gone through a number of Lincoln's documents and found that when you take sections in similar words, you really can start to see the similarity between them. Now just delving back into history a little bit, Portland charts, we have one of the earliest from 1320 at the library, and these were early nautical charts of the Mediterranean that were used to look at travels across the Mediterranean. But there were a lot of questions from the curator about how were these actually created, and could we confirm that these weren't from a cottage industry that was around 500 years later. When we start to look at this with the spectral imaging, we can find a lot of different types of information. So in fact, when we look at the text itself, it's sometimes difficult to see how materials are layered. When we do the processing, we can see here that some of the lines are going over the text. Now this is unusual because the way maps are created historically is all the lines are put down, the rum lines, the coastline is added, and then the names are put in next. So some of what we're doing is creating more questions than we necessarily answer as we start to understand more about how these materials are created. If you look at these toponyms or place names that were used to provenance the material, in the lower right corner, you can see how these pop up when we do the processing. So these allow people to really think more about the provenance. And just another quick example shows how wonderfully visual it is and takes away the scariness of science. we can make it very visually interactive and important for curators and researchers. The creation techniques were very interesting. With the imaging, a lot of these documents that are under vault and don't get out much, they only come down to the lab for a very short period of time. So the processing and the imaging is very important. We were looking at finding where there are actual compass holes within this piece of parchment, and we find this relates back perfectly to a hidden circle, which had been one of the questions about how these documents were created. Watermarks are also something that's very important in terms of the understanding and the provenance. So you see here a Dunlap broadside, an early printing of the Declaration of Independence, with transmitted and reflected, and then when we process, we can take away the text, and we now have a wonderful Dutch watermark that I've also linked with other documents that were written in Paris when the paper was taken from Philadelphia, when people were presenting declaration copies to the King of Prussia. Now I'm going to just very quickly finish by linking together some other documents in our collections. The Waldseemüller 1507 world map, sometimes referred to as the Birth Certificate of America, first reference to America here on sheet 8, and sheets 6 and 7 here have original red grid lines where people were trying to show how do I show 2D to 3D rendition. So with the processing, we can now bring up those original red grid lines, and this is very important for early cartography in terms of where those start and finish. We don't want to take samples, but we can take a pixel sample of the image and now tell us what the original material was to make those red grid lines, even though they're faded, that's still there. It's a historic madder pigment that was captured from a plant. And this is something that I find really fascinating. When we do a combination of a range of those bands, and this is also using the raking or the side lighting, we can now recreate what the original wood block that it was printed from might have looked like. So you see here just a section from that sheet with America on. We're now looking at early incunabula and techniques and the type of tools that they had at that time. If we look forward now to what that looked like on the modern map, it's very close around the bottom of South America, and colleagues of mine in Europe are now looking at this to try and understand what the sources were for creating this map and what known journeys had already been undertaken. Let's take that a little bit further and link together collections. So we have the Ptolemy Geographia from 1513. What's interesting about this, we have 3 different watermarks in the papers within this document. This crown watermark here is interesting because, in fact, it's the exact same watermark that we find in the Waldseemüller map. So to cut another really long story short, we put this all together. A group of people start in Saint-Dié, France in 1506 to print the Geographia. They then get funding from Duke René to print the Waldseemüller map. So they pause, because it's much more lucrative, thank you. Been travelling too much. And they then lose their sponsor, so they have to relocate to Strasbourg, and then they finish printing the Ptolemy. So we've now started to link together these very disparate documents within our collections. Last example from New York here, Bartók's Final Concerto for Orchestra. He moved to New York, and this was the only one that he wrote while he was in America. But this was laminated in its history, which meant that the changes, where there were 4 layers within this document, were no longer visible. With the imaging, we could actually look through these 4 layers and bring up his original score. So this is really fun because the music division loves to actually play the original scores and think about the changes. Why is this important? The way we visualize information now and link it back to the original document is really quite fascinating. So think about if we're creating a Google map of a document, and I'm just going to show a flat image of this, but this is something we're working on. So if we look at the Gettysburg Address here, we can click anywhere on that document, like a Google map, and bring up some of the handwriting, some of the processing, some of the documents, the particles that we're finding on that, the spectra of the ink, and the fingerprint, and start to pull these all together. So just in closing, I want to say, I think this has demonstrated that the preservation of the original is really critical, that we can use this to essentially do document archaeology and understand the layers that are contained within these original historic documents. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Thanks to Janet for putting together what's really been a fantastic panel so far. My role on this panel is to talk a bit about how historians use sources, documents, and how they experience the difference between digital and physical materials. Unfortunately, it's very hard, if not impossible, to generalize about what historians will do. Every historian, without exception, will tell you that. So my approach, I think, is going to be to talk a little bit autobiographically about some of my own experiences, which do span some of the differences we've talked about, and also to step back a bit and talk about a couple of types of history that speak very directly to the different issues on either side. So in the few minutes I have, I'm going to muse about the dream of the universal library that digitization has made increasingly possible. Then I'm going to ponder the social life of information and think a bit about what we lose if we don't get our hands dusty. And then finally, I'm going to tell you a story about a 140-year-old diaper, and then I'll be done. Digitization is the greatest thing to happen to historical research in my lifetime. And it really is just in a generation. I'm just about old enough that when I started university, most of my university library catalog looks like this. It's just card catalogs and books with entries glued into them. And now suddenly we have the possibility of the so-called universal library, right? The whole world's knowledge, putatively, at our fingertips. And that transforms research in a whole lot of ways. Digital copying, the internet, give you access. Unbelievable access. It really dramatically presses down the cost of gathering information, even just thinking about the small fact that you don't have to travel as much, right? About a decade ago, when I was doing doctoral research, I came across this letter. This is a letter that Alexander Graham Bell wrote to his wife on the first night of his first big patent trial, where he complains about his lawyers not understanding him, not understanding his invention, more or less at the same time that they were winning the patent cases that would make him a legend. This is the letter that made me realize that it was the lawyers, much more than Alexander Graham Bell, who led to him being recognized as the great inventor of the telephone, led to a lot of ideas we have about great inventors in American technology. As Nick said, this is kind of the basis of my first book. In some ways, it's been the launching point for a lot of my scholarly career and interests ever since. So that was a big deal for me. This letter is in the Library of Congress, but it was part of the library's pioneering efforts. The Bell family papers were one of their earlier efforts to digitize and curate manuscript collections online. And I actually read this for the first time in England, 3,000 miles away from where it was sitting, and it's not at all obvious to me. In fact, I think it's pretty clear that I would not have gone looking for this. I would not have traveled to Washington to look for and find this letter had it not been just available to me a long way away. That kind of access, that kind of global access, doesn't just make it much cheaper and much quicker for historians to do their work, although it does those things. It also has this opening effect, right? It has equity implications, right? Because it's no longer just the best-funded scholars, the best-funded grad students who have the support to go and travel to see collections. So this changes history, it changes historians too. But wait, it's not just that you can access historical books and archives, but you can search them, right? In the age of Google, I don't really need to tell you how incredible an experience that is, just to be able to do a full-text search and pull things from all sorts of points in history, all sorts of places in the world. And with the big repositories, the Google Books, the Hathi Trust, the Making of Modern Law database, you can make these connections and get answers with incredible speed. If you want to trace the uses of a phrase like shouting fire in a crowded theater, which is not Oliver Wendell Holmes's language, but is what we think he said popularly, then you can do that. You can do that straight away. You can start pulling together your materials, start tracking trends, emergencies over time. You can do that instantly. Now, these are examples of how digitization can make the work of an old-fashioned craft historian, and because this is Brooklyn, we can say an artisanal historian, much easier and better. But perhaps more profoundly, there are entirely new kinds of historical research one can do. Aggregating and analyzing historical sources in ways that were impossible to do by hand. Data visualization, geographic mapping, text mining. There's an emerging field already now, an emerged field of computational humanities, digital humanities, that does all of these things. So for example, you can now see what areas were controlled by the US Army during Reconstruction, right? See it on a map. You can figure that out using a mixture of primary sources and computer power and mapping software. That's key to the protection of black rights and the development of party politics in the period after the Civil War, right? That's on-the-ground information that will provide you context. Or you can chart the networks of citation between different Supreme Court cases. This is actually something put together by our former colleague here, Roger Mikalski. Graphics that put together tens of thousands of Supreme Court cases, seeing which ones cite other ones, which areas of law link to other areas of law, how that changes over time. It's incredibly powerful, automated processes. The most accessible example, I think, the one you can play with at home, and certainly I do obsessively, is Google Ngrams. So if you haven't seen this, this is a facility within Google Books that lets you look at the percentage of books for any given year in their collection that mention particular terms or phrases. And what I'm about to show you isn't in any way scientific, right? I do not endorse this as a rigorous historical method, but it's a bit of fun and shows you what I'm talking about. So if, for example, you wanted to show or check that the words free speech appear in books more often in wartime, you've got conspicuous peaks. The words free speech in Google Books, Civil War, the First World War, Second World War, Vietnam. That's aggregate information you'd never be able to count for yourself. You can, changing gears a bit, see when the term intellectual property was invented, right? It's not a thing before the late 20th century, and then after the 1980s, you don't say patent and copyright and trademark anymore, you say intellectual property, which is way sexier. Because it's Constitution Day, you can compare, for example, privileges and immunities and due process, right? Two different avenues for thinking about how the US Constitution approaches fundamental rights, and you can see when one clearly overtakes the other. As I say, this is not scientific by any means, but illustrative of the sort of thing you can do. There are more and more very sophisticated approaches to text mining, both in literature and in history. There's a really interesting recent student note in the Yale Law Journal that used, unsupervised topic modeling, very sophisticated algorithmic method, to look at 25,000 newspaper front pages, 32 million words, and confirm that people were very interested in constitutional change in the late 1860s and early 1870s. It's not an earth-shaking conclusion, but the process, the method is very interesting. 40 pages of technical details about how to do it. Not every historian wants to tell big data stories. That's completely understandable. But even the biographers, even the people who work in miniature can now get context for your stories in ways that never would have been possible or would have been incredibly hard before. Okay, so what's lost? If you don't keep and curate, and as historians ultimately study and pay attention to the actual physical documents, what's lost? One thing I sort of worry a lot about is the streetlight phenomenon. So you know this metaphor? This is, you don't know where you've dropped your keys, but you're going to look for them under the lamppost because that's where the light is, right? I think we don't want to be like economists where you are always looking for the answers where the data is because that's the only place you've got light. And then missing things because they aren't digitized, because they aren't in the supposedly universal searchable corpus, as Mike says. There's a lot that isn't. And digitization creates another set of gatekeepers, for good or ill. If you think about the kinds of documents, the kinds of people who might leave their documents to libraries and archives, the kinds of things that libraries and archives might choose to digitize, we can't take anything in that process for granted. And there are always going to be outsiders, resistors, dissenters, people who should have their stories told, but who aren't automatically going to get in the system. So that's a concern, I think, if we lean more and more on these kinds of resources. But more importantly, there's a whole subdiscipline of history that points out the historical value of the written medium itself. And this is the stuff that Mike and others were talking about far more elegantly than I could. Information itself has a social history. Right, so the things that historians think of as primary sources, the books, the letters, the case reports, those things don't just act as vehicles and vessels for historical information. They are historical information. They're artifacts that we may well need to understand as things in order to understand what's in them. And for several decades, there has been a really powerful and interesting field of history of the book that says, among other things, if you really want to understand the marketplace of ideas, you have to know practical things about how ideas circulated. Right? So you can't just go and read the book. You have to know about booksellers, about publishing, about pricing, who had what and when they had it, and how and why. And those are insights that apply especially strongly in legal history, because if you're trying to talk about what the law was, if you're trying to look at what authority was, you don't just need to know what's in the law books. Right? For those of you who are practicing lawyers, that's only one step. Right? What actually goes on the ground, or who's using the law, where it is and where it isn't, those are profoundly important variables. And one project I was thinking about particularly here is the ongoing work of Daniel Holzebosch at NYU Law on Chancellor Kent and his library. So if you haven't come across this guy, James Kent is possibly the most important state court judge of the early 19th century, profoundly formative figure in American law who codified and wrote treatises and brought together reports, pretty much self-consciously an American Blackstone. And what Dan Holzebosch has done is sort of look at his library. So you can see the sources that Kent is using as raw material for his commentaries on American law. And even more than that, you can see how he reacted to them, because he did write in his books. He wrote reactions to what was on the page. He corresponded with authors and then glued his letters into the books. He wrote down when he bought them and how much he paid on the frontispiece. And that actually starts to become an incredibly valuable resource for learning about the law book market in early America. You can see where his copies are coming from. Right? A lot of them are coming from Irish printers or from Dublin in ways that get around English copyright law. Right? You can see the supply lines that in a very literal way show you how ideas moved from the old world to the new. And all this evidence is preserved because of the way that these books were, for the most part, kept together, because of the ways that they were preserved with the notes and the additions that Kent made, and because of the ways that scholars are willing to learn from books like this as objects of interest in themselves. Even when it's not, I mean, the easy case is many of the kind of classic great texts where you care about who wrote what and what changes it went through, your Magna Carta, your Declaration of Independence. But all this stuff is incredibly valuable even for the next rung down and the more mundane. Okay, so finally, the tale of the diaper. So as Nick and Janet suggested, my own recent research has been on the history of American patent law. And I've mostly been using a source that no one else has used for this. I've been looking at the original records of the cases filed in the federal courts, which have been wonderfully preserved and expertly curated by the National Archives, to whom I'm very grateful. Hi. Thanks to these archives, I've discovered things like there was more patent litigation in New York in 1883 than there was in 2013. True fact. Kind of surprising. But one of the things that, when I opened a case file one day, just fell out on me was this, a 140-year-old diaper. This is an exhibit in a patent infringement case from 1870. The invention is a waterproof pantaloon-style diaper for babies and small children. I have my own reasons for thinking that's a really important invention. And I'll confess, this diaper did change the way I thought about what I was working on. It reminded me just how much of the lawyering that I was writing about didn't happen on the page. Right? How much of the patent litigation that I was spending all my time thinking about was about physical exhibits, machines, devices, things that were being performed in the courtroom. And that reminded me in turn that patent law is really a law of things and machines and artifacts in many ways. And it made me think about this diaper, about the way we tell stories as historians, right? How powerful it can be to be able to communicate things about what it was really like, right, in the most tactile way that you can, given the resources you have. And I think it's really hard as a historian of law to get at that through paper alone. And it can be harder still if we distance ourselves from the texts and the objects we're studying. I mean, you can see, not just with professional historians, but with students, with all sorts of interested people, how they feel, as Mike says, about getting their hands on the artifact. So I'm glad to have had my hands on this diaper in a decidedly non-digital way. That said, I recently wrote an article in which I cited this file, and I had to produce evidence of what I said was in it. So I needed to get hold of the diaper for a journal site check. It's being held in suburban Pennsylvania, so the archivists were kind enough to photograph it and email it to me. So even in this area, I can't quite get away from the thrill and the benefits of digitization. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So our final speaker, Christina.
So Janet has asked me to address the question of can we rely on technology for preservation? And there's two answers to this question that exist in some interesting tension. So the first one is maybe. And the second one is that we have to. Right, and so why we have to, that's not just hyperbole, right? In the course of a lot today, we've been talking about documents that we can access in an unmediated way. We can just pick them up and read them. And when we think about libraries and museums, we're often thinking about materials that can be accessed in an unmediated manner. Books, paintings, sculptures. But so much technology, and that this is not new, so much information, rather, can only be accessed through some sort of mediation between the object that contains the information and the human being trying to access it. When we talk about preserving digital files and digital information, we're really asking similar questions and dealing with similar challenges that we've been dealing with for quite a while. And to illustrate this, I brought in an old Thomas Edison cylinder. So before there was the flat record, there was the cylinder. There was a needle that went around it, and the cylinder rotated. And this is a great illustration of how the challenges of digital media are really the same as a lot of other kinds of media, right? So right now, this happens to be blank, but we couldn't access whatever was on the cylinder without something that could play it. And this highlights the two challenges that come from, that we need to face dealing with new technology that records information in ways that need to be mediated. So on the one hand, we need to deal with the question of can we access it? Do we have the additional tool needed to get the information off of the cylinder and into my ear? And secondarily, we need to deal with, as we need to with books and paintings and the like, the issue of information degradation. And the reason this may be changed or different in the modern technological period is that more and more devices and tools are being created where we don't necessarily think long-term about how long this is going to last, or the people manufacturing it aren't necessarily thinking about the long term. I was reading an article yesterday, actually, where Fenella France was quoted because of her and the Library of Congress's efforts to experiment with how fast audio CDs degrade and DVDs. And apparently, and correct me if I'm wrong, you can send the CDs that you don't want to the Library of Congress, and they will do experiments on them and destroy them for you. So that's great. So we have these two challenges, right? On the one hand, trying to prevent degradation of the actual information that we're interested in, and second, how to maintain the ability to access the information in the first place. And there's a couple strategies that we as a society are going to want to employ in order to do this. So one, the obvious, right? Multiple copies, multiple formats, multiple ways in which to access the material. So that's, in one sense, a way to try to prevent degradation. Mediation is interesting and complex because it kind of depends on what you're going for. From the digital context, we get two different ways of trying to preserve the ability to access information, emulation and migration. The idea of emulation kind of comes a little bit more from, if you think back on the old Nintendo Entertainment System, right? Classic games like Super Mario Brothers and Donkey Kong, and right now, very few people have a working Nintendo Entertainment System, but many people have created programs called emulators that allow these games to be played on your modern general purpose computer. So we have these alternate mechanisms. So I think the more general way of thinking about this would be an emulator is a new tool to access original information in the original format. And so if I made, for example, a modern needle and rotation system that could play this cylinder, in some sense this is emulating the experience. And the emulator is what we want to do when we want to preserve the original object, right? There's as so many of the speakers have talked about today, it is super great, and there's so much richness in the original source of the information. The con of this is then you also need to preserve the emulator. Great, right? Now we've just doubled the problem. The other tool is migration, changing the format while preserving the information. You obviously lose something there. Great tool for when your focus is just making the content available. If on a cylinder we had a recording of some very important old song or old speech, it might be just as important to preserve the physical object and the richness there, as well as to make that content available more broadly and make it more possible for more people to access, and that there's less of a chance that it will be lost by accident. This, however, does raise some interesting questions, or rather this story about the different challenges presented by trying to use modern preservation techniques to raise some interesting questions. One of them is a legal one. Does the law as it stands give us the tools that allow people to use the existing tools in a way that's going to be helpful and sufficient, right? And in a lot of ways, copyright law is failing us here. We always have fair use to rely on, but it is it's unclear how courts are going to decide it. There's a special section in the Copyright Act, Section 108, that enumerates specific rights for libraries and archives to make extra copies of things in order to preserve them. But in the digital age, these are really insufficient, these provisions. So, for example, 108C says that a library or an archive can make up to 3 copies of something if the existing format of a work has become obsolete. This clashes very strongly with the notion that lots of copies keep stuff safe, right? We're going to want to keep copies of digital files in many places and have many copies of them, not because someone doesn't want to pay an author, but because that's just the legitimately best way to preserve the possibility that something is going to continue to be around for a long period of time. Section 108H loosens these rules in the last 20 years of a work's copyright. But again, in the modern digital age, that's not a sufficiently short amount of time, right? That might be appropriate for a book, which is going to degrade over a longer period of time. But when we're talking about a digital file, we have a number of years, often in the single digits, before it's going to start to be important to make copies, to migrate it to a different format, to do something that preserves the work. So one thing we might worry about is whether the law is allowing for what would otherwise be most important to happen. And second, and here's where we get controversial, yes, right? An interesting question is whether institutions and libraries are going to be sufficient on their own. So two different stories to get here. One is, I don't know if anyone's ever been familiar with the idea of abandonware. We're back to video games and computer games. But there's lots and lots of really fascinating and historically important cultural content from the 80s, 90s, early 2000s that people who are basically amateurs have preserved, create emulators for, migrate to different formats so that people can still play and access these games. And they're often presented for download if they're not commercially available, totally illegally on the internet. And if it were not for a lot of these people who are, enthusiastic amateurs, not necessarily affiliated with any institution, a lot of these really important cultural linchpins might be lost to us. There's a great quote from an Italian historian, Luciano Canfora, who says, "What's come down to us is derived not from great centers, but from marginal locations such as convents and from scattered private copies." And he makes this conclusion by saying, what do people do when they sack a city? They burn libraries, they destroy the centers of information, and so we get a lot of great works where the only copies have been from these really odd and unusual locations. And so the thesis maybe of this talk is that libraries are incredibly necessary, but possibly not sufficient. And that what we actually want to do is have as much diversification as possible, not just in the technological format in which we hold things, but also in who's the party that is doing the archiving and the preserving. And so I'm going to close with a really cute story, because that is the way we are doing this today, about movies in the 1920s. So, we always hear these stories of, we thought a bunch of movies had been lost to time and we found several. And one of the best stories of these are from a former swimming pool / ice skating rink in the Yukon. So back in the 20s, the movie studios would, getting some strange feedback. The movie studios would, they kept the title to the copies of film reels, but they would send them further north, and as a movie theater was finished showing a film, they would, mail it up to a theater further north, and it would, had a kind of routine. And the final stop was in Dawson City in the Yukon, and because of the cost of mailing the films back, a lot of film studios were like, why don't you just keep them? And so because no one thought that would be that interesting to continue to have copies of these films, at one point they were going to fill in a swimming pool and turn it into an ice skating rink, and they filled the pool with all these reels of old films and then covered it with ice. In 1978, they excavated the ice skating rink, and a great number of films that had previously been lost to time had been preserved under the ice skating rink, because one of the few ways to retard degradation of silver nitrate is to keep it very cold. So the moral of the story is we really don't know what's going to work and not work. And so we should do a great diversity of methods in order to preserve the information and culture and documents that we have before us, because you never know if you're going to be an ice skating rink in the Yukon.
So I think we can take a couple of minutes for questions if people have any questions. See one there. He's going to bring you the microphone.
One of the issues that's often raised for digitization and then destruction of the originals is storage space and the cost of storage. And so there is a lot of triage that archivists and librarians have to do in terms of what's permanently considered valuable and what isn't. Would anybody like to comment on that dilemma?
I think that's a very interesting question. But however, with the digital, we're getting exactly the same issue. People don't really consider the fact that the cloud is not just up there, it's actually on huge servers. So one of the initiatives that's going on is that libraries are actually getting together to look at who has the best copies of various copies of books and trying to make sure that there are a number of copies available, but they can start to look more effectively at dealing with the storage space. There's a big move towards compact storage, and that, of course, makes curators crazy because it means they can't just go into the stacks and access them, but it does mean that we can preserve the diversity of the collections that we have. So, yes, a number of people are really trying to address that, but I also wanted to note that it's a huge issue in terms of the digital component as well as the physical.
Hang on, he's going to.
Appreciation. Hi, this is more comment of appreciation to the entire panel, and particularly me learning and understanding the ancestral lineage, that the importance of touching, feeling an object that the internet or the cloud cannot provide. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So speaking as a member of the Digerati who hasn't bought an analog book in 15 years, this was fascinating to me. But I want to give a plug to two Brooklyn startups, an old line Brooklyn startup and a new Brooklyn startup, both of which are, so we've got Singularity and Company down in Dumbo. They are now one of the largest publishers of science fiction books in the world today, although they don't publish new science fiction. They, through a Kickstarter campaign, another Brooklyn company, have raised money to preserve lost or out-of-print science fiction books. So I just want to point to two wonderful Brooklyn startups that I think are bridging the old and the new in the way you folks are talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just yell.
I've been told you have to use the microphone.
On the technical side, when you're digitizing records, are they, should they be a PDF file, a JPEG file? How does one save it? Do you save it as, for example, 300 DPI, or you go higher, 700 DPI in saving literally documents? Or are there any comments you have on that?
I'll try. What's most important for a very long period of preservation is a variety of formats, and a lot of universities and institutions focus mostly on what the likelihood is that the format will still be usable in the future. So things that are non-proprietary or open source, and just using a variety. So I was looking yesterday at what Hathi Trust and Project Gutenberg and institutions like that do, and they have different sizes of picture files, going from your straight .text file, which is just ASCII characters, to more advanced formats that allow for more interesting formatting. But the basic idea is trying to make as good guesses as possible about what's going to be usable in the future, and saving things in a variety of ways in a variety of places. Because these are all kind of rolling the dice for each one, and so you want to diversify the options.
Just to take that a little bit further, I'm happy to talk with you further. The library has what we can talk about as recommended formats for different materials. So PDF-A is one, for example, but the main focus is usually on a lossless format, so like a TIFF file. The flip side of that is if you're trying to make something accessible on the internet, then you probably want to use a JPEG because it's smaller and more accessible. But for long-term preservation, there are a number of standards that have been developed. The FAGD group does a lot of standards for digitization. Quite often now the standard for DPI is around 600, but again, it often depends on what resources you have available as well, and exactly what Christina said too, there's various components with that.
I think Nick had a question.
Follow-up question, though, is there a way in which you've addressed, when you preserve now something in the digital age, how you could attest now that that is the genuine copy from the original? Have you encountered that problem yet, and what are your solutions?
So that's getting into digital forensics, and yes, there is a huge move to actually try to assure that there's some way of tagging those files to ensure the provenance and make certain that what you're seeing is actually the original. Long answer, I can talk to you later.
So I have a quick question and then a deeper, darker question. The quick question is for Michael. Do you have any hunches on why those books were so small? what struck me as soon as I looked at them is like they were working books that you know, the way U.S. congressmen and other people keep a copy of the Constitution in their breast pocket.
Yeah, I agree. I think they're portable. I think that's the main thing, and also cheaper to produce. They're produced for a clientele that doesn't have a lot of money. The manuscript's a little bit different, but I think portability is still important. I think some people I've seen have referred to these early Magna Cartas as kind of like precious little, you know, like almost like keepsake things, and that doesn't ring true to me for those. I think the portability was something that was important.
Well, which implies that it's not a cold, unused document or artifact, that it's something that is, you know, like a workhorse being used in some respects. So it's interesting. So the deeper, darker kind of reflections are, somebody who's been working a lot in privacy law, listening to all this concern about preservation in the digital age seems the flip of all the concerns about being able to delete information, you know, in the movement in Europe about the difficulties of the right to forget, for example. So this is sort of an interesting take on it. But one of the thoughts that I've had, and it's a concern, is how, at least in the development of law, that law and the common law has evolved by the comparison of dissimilar things. That's some kind of an Amber Alert. I haven't been able to figure out what it is. I think we're okay to sit here till I finish the question, then you'll all want to leave. So it's the comparison of dissimilar things, and then also the role, like in science, that serendipity has. This is why I'm uncomfortable with sort of the just merely online newspaper reading. You know, I remember being in the stacks reading microfilm in the Yale library, looking at sporting news for my paper, writing paper, back 100 years ago, and I never got past page 3 because I was reading, you know, instead of what I was supposed to be reading, you know, the ads for sports equipment. And so it seems to me that somehow when you're searching digitally and you're using that as a research method, you're much more inclined, because of the way that computers operate, to find what you're looking for. So you're somehow stunted in moving towards research that is comparing similar things or adding up similar things, rather than accidentally making a connection between two things that are dissimilar but finding some kind of a link. And I wonder if that's totally off the wall, or you have any of you have any thoughts about that? Chris, you were nodding a little bit. I'll put you on the spot. I know that was a courtesy nod for the dean. But
No. That's a nod of fundamental and deep agreement. I think the power of search is just incredible for being able to go somewhere and get what you want, and you can now get so much more of what you want that it can crowd out what you think you don't want. So the opportunity cost of powerful search is considerable. One thing I'm very happy about is that a lot of the repositories and platforms do build in thought about browsing as well as searching. It may just be my computer. I find it very slow to go between pages of a lot of these digitized images, so I feel myself disinclined to browse when I can search exactly the right point. But it's clear that some of the software for digitizing, especially old law books and treatises, has thought carefully about issues of serendipity, right? What's the digital analog of going for the thing you want and then finding something on the shelf next to it that turns out to be way more important? And I really appreciate the thought that's gone into that.
I would love to tell an anecdote that riffs on this, and also is like a long thank you to Michael Widener, if he remembers me, which is that, you know, in all of this discussion, we've been talking about these documents, both physical and digital, a little bit as though they're separate from the human like the way that humans process knowledge. And one thing that we should never forget, whether in an age of great search tools or library catalogs, is the amount that human know-how is important to understanding what has happened historically. So a couple years ago, and I'm not sure Michael remembers me, I went down to the Rare Book Library to procrastinate and said, hi, I heard that there were these translations of the Constitution made into foreign languages, but I don't know if any of them ever were recorded or if they still exist. And and I had been asking just tons of people because it sounded so interesting. And after talking with Michael for a very long time, he found digitized copies that had been made by several German historians of constitutions and sent them to me, and this resulted in a great paper, which I'm going to send him when it finally gets published. But what I found so fascinating after this had happened is I had been asking dozens of people about this, and I found out that they had been printed in a book, and lo and behold, the physical books that had printed typed versions of these were sitting in the normal stacks of the Yale Law Library. But none of many, 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 many people knew that these things existed or that they were, in fact, right under our nose the whole time. So for all of the wonderful information that we have accessible in the world, key is also having the right systems in place, which is both Google searching and human know-how to figure out that it's there in the first place.
So I think one more question, and then we have to break.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. So I'm going to start with a real quick comment and then sort of hope that any of you may have some sort of answer. I think Orwell had it very right that that history and the future will become very malleable in the digital age, right? So we are always at war with East Asia, right? With digitization, this becomes more and more dangerous. Amazon, we saw, actually changed their edition of 1984 through their Kindles. Twitter now doesn't allow for us to maintain history of tweets that politicians and stuff are changing. So is there any path to preservation that any of you can foresee to keep us from continuously changing our past or changing things with propaganda or that sort of thing?
If you're talking from a digital perspective, there's a huge move in terms of web archiving, which is to allow you to track over time. And if I could think of the person's name, I'd say it, but it eludes me right this second. And so it really is being able to capture that snapshot at a period in time so that you can see when things were or not deliberately changed. And that, I think, allows us to pull out some of that information. But that's in terms of just the volume of data and the fact that, as many people noted, much of it is not archived, then it is a huge challenge. But there are significant moves to be able to do just that.
Okay, well, thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel.
Yeah. So, thank you all. That was just amazing, and I'm sure we could have. The time flew by. Michael and Julia. By the way, Julia, I don't think it's cheeky to compare the statutes of Merton College, but I have a little bit of a bias to Magna Carta. Christina, Fenella, Chris, and our incomparable own librarian, Janet, who also regularly wins the spelling bee that we have here with students. She's so many talents and just absolutely courageous.